Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
I'm delighted to be joined by the poet, rapper, activist, man of many parts, Akala, who's just got this rather brilliant book out called Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire, or Natives, I think is the main title. Is that right? Is that right? There we go. Trying to give you a pump, a bit of a promo there, but the camera didn't seem to be working. But nonetheless, we know what it's all. We know what it's all about. Bestseller, I believe, already.
Yeah, apparently so. Yeah, it came out last week.
Now, so much to talk about, and I was very moved actually by the extract that was, I think, in The Guardian over the weekend, where you talked about when you were being racially abused. I think you were 5 at the time, is that right?
Yeah.
And you came home and started to talk to your mum, and then for the first time you sort of realised that, you know, you had a white mum and you're black, and this sort of had a big impact on your...
Well, I think the idea of racial identity first occurred to me at that point. When you're a kid and you're that young, you're just a child. And I think one of the reasons I recount that incident in there and other incidents, you know, through growing up, getting put in a special needs class for kids who don't speak English, you know, just...
Because you were a bright kid, it's absolutely extraordinary.
Well, no, it isn't, actually. It comes back to the larger discussion of the way in which the British education system is very much stratified by class. We are not interested in turning kids in Easterhouse and Glasgow into rocket scientists, into the next Roger Penrose. And so this inevitably produces conflicts with children who are too bright or get ideas above their station. And so I sort of fitted into that narrative. And so I was put in this special needs group, which isn't very uncommon. That we used to have schools for the mentally subnormal. They were then gone into schools for educationally subnormal. There's a lot of good literature on sort of post-war British education that deals with the conflict between, I suppose, the ambitions of incoming migrants to the country with the reality of a very heavily class-stratified education system. And that's some of what I try to highlight in the book.
And, I mean, I just talked to the Education Minister, Anne Milton, about the appallingly few sort of black people who are getting into Oxford, but it's not just Oxford, actually. It's not quite as bad at Cambridge, but it's bad, and it's bad at lots of the other top universities. Are they just... What's going wrong?
I mean, I don't know a whole load about the admissions policies of those particular universities, in fairness to them. But there is lots of good literature. So, for example, Bristol and Warwick University did national studies looking at every school in the country a couple of years ago. And again, they looked at how... so if you've got the same grades as other students, what is the likelihood of you getting entered for higher tier GCSE when adjusted for race, when adjusted for class? People can read the conclusions. They did what they call blind marking, which is something they do all over the world. How do teachers assess their students' intelligence in the classroom versus their actual test scores? Again, people can read these results. The Department for Education have stuff looking at disproportionate exclusions, etc. So there's lots of good literature out there to suggest that, as I've said before, we have a really heavily class-stratified education system.
What do we do about it?
Well, one of the things we could do is have... so we currently have, you know, standardised testing, but we have no standardised criteria for GCSE entrance. Your teacher basically gets to decide how smart they think you are or you're not. What should happen, really, is GCSE entrance should be based solely on...
So the discrimination, in your view, starts much earlier than the moment people apply to university?
Not in my view. In the empirical
sure, but
data,
I mean,
in those studies, I didn't write those studies, which is why I'm quoting them.
And so we rely too much... You're saying we rely too much on the subjective judgment of teachers?
No, I'm saying that the challenge, when you have a hierarchical society, the challenge is how you reproduce that and tell yourself that you're not reproducing it. If a kid is particularly bright and he lives in Easterhouse in Glasgow, he obviously does, or she obviously does not have the same life opportunities as a kid in the south of Kensington.
But in fact, surely the big issue for class is private education.
Of course.
7% of kids get sent to private schools, and yet a massive amount of the top place at university and the top jobs in the establishment go to the kids from those schools, and that's where class comes from.
And people do not spend tens of thousands of pounds a year to send their kids to Harrow or Eton to expect a kid to get the same quality of education at a state school. Obviously not, otherwise they wouldn't pay for it. And so I think even the policy you were discussing earlier, the apprenticeships policy...
Well, these T-levels, yeah.
Essentially, yeah. That is obviously not designed for kids who've gone to Eton and Harrow. So it is obviously designed for state kids to get working-class jobs. And so I think we have to be honest about some of this history and the difficulty of managing an economy. And I think this, isolating it just to Oxbridge, is kind of missing the entire point of the bigger discussion.
Look, there's so much I want to talk to you about. We haven't got an enormous amount of time. You, I think, take the view that a reintroduction of stop and search for knives, because obviously knife crime in London nationally is a huge issue.
I'm so glad you said nationally. London last year was the 8th most violent police district in Britain. So we may want to ask why London is being compared to New York and not to Glasgow, not to Liverpool, places that
the
had...
Glasgow references today.
No, I'm half Scottish, right? So it's fascinating to me that as someone who's half Scottish and half black London, that I'm associated with the problems in London, but not with my Scottish cousins in Glasgow. I'm not saying intelligence-targeted stop and search, when you have information, is one thing. Ethnically targeted stop and search leads to stupid stuff like Daniel Kaluuya, one of the most successful actors in this country, getting dragged off a bus and strip searched. The last time I was pulled over was 6 months ago. I teach Shakespeare and African history for a living.
Yes.
And what was specifically said was, gang members drive cars like this. And I thought, well, that's what happens when gang crime in one part of the country, even though it exists in less than 0.005% of a particular group, is made ethnically specific, and in another part
No, it's incredibly frustrating, but unfortunately I've got to say goodbye. Thanks to Akala, Tom, and